So before we get into the New York Times piece, I do want to check in, see if there's anybody here who is here in this class for the first time. Okay, so a couple of you. So last class, I had folks introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about themselves, such as where they're from, classes that they might be taking, their nature, and then maybe an example of conflict they have dealt with recently, and so on. So you don't have to do a super long introduction, but maybe just tell us your name and a couple things about you. So let's start here in the front.
My name is Oliver. I'm from Boise. I went to 3 years at Rocky Mountain College in Montana before I came here. And one of the, my major is business. And then one of the things I've had recently that was in conflict was my friend that goes to school here told me I couldn't move into the house after he said I could like a week ago. So I had to figure that out, but it all worked out.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. Welcome. Glad to have you here, Oliver, on Monday. A lot of folks brought up different results, right? So I'm glad that it worked out in your situation. Some people said, they dealt with a conflict, they felt good afterwards. Other people felt like they weren't heard or felt angry. So, the different responses that we have at the end of the conflict is a big thing that we'll be diving more into. Got somebody here in the back as well. Yes, hi.
I'm Cody Zomer from Davenport, Washington. I'm an ag science major. What was the other thing?
Maybe an example of a conflict that you've encountered recently.
I can't think of one off the top of my head.
Not a problem. It takes some time to think through that, Ideally, if you don't run into conflict a lot, right, that works out pretty well. So glad to have you both here, Oliver and Cody. Welcome. So I recommend, if you haven't already, I have the recording from Monday's class available. I'd recommend just reviewing that along with the syllabus. I didn't take attendance for Monday, but I am going to take attendance from here on out. So do make sure to either come or complete the makeup activity if you can't make class. So last class, we did some introductions. We went over kind of some of the basics of conflict management. And there were a couple core ideas that we brought up. First of all, conflict management is different from conflict resolution. Resolution is about ending a conflict, and we're oftentimes compelled to end a conflict as soon as possible. Conflict management is recognizing that conflict's not necessarily bad, but that there are ways to optimize and make a good experience out of that. And then we also went over the syllabus, schedule, course policies. All of those things are available on Canvas, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about those or remaining issues. For today's class, I want us to look into that New York Times piece just a little bit more to understand where it fits in our overall discussion. And we're going to do kind of a brief introduction to some core concepts and elements of conflict management. So your textbook you don't have a reading requirement for your textbook until Friday, but I did want to preview some of the stuff that we'll be going over that connects to that campaign. So, this New York Times piece is very much concerned with family conflict and how family conflict has changed over the course of COVID-19. And I'd love to hear from a few of you in terms of the things that you wrote down in your prompt for today. What stood out to you? What did you find especially interesting, like passages or stories or experiences that people reported in that piece? Yeah.
Well, I personally really relate to this article because my family, we're all essential workers, so including myself, we all kind of live normally.
Yeah.
So right at the beginning when COVID happened, I was living with my boyfriend, and I could tell he got more annoyed with me because he was an essential worker.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, oh, can I go to work with you? So we were like together 24/7.
Oh, yeah.
The things that we did that we didn't know annoy each other started to annoy us.
Yeah.
Good now, so.
Yeah. That's a really good point, though, right? Because a lot of folks have found that having that close proximity, working from home, dealing with that, has raised a lot of unique challenges, right? My partner and I lived in a tiny third-floor apartment, and so she was the only one with an office last year, so we had to alternate who's gonna go into the office and, take meetings and who's gonna stay home. Like, there's a lot of challenges that have come in, just in terms of physical proximity. What else stood out to folks in terms of stories, experiences, and so on they noticed? Yeah.
I read like one that stuck out to me was I think you would say like Malia. She had problems with her mom at one time from just spending so much time in that proximity with each other during quarantine and throughout the whole pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And then she said that those got better, and I kind of related that to like when we came here before last year, we had to quarantine for like 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And so I was like roommates, we were kind of butting heads, so a lot of us were, and then once we were kind of able to leave and get back to a normal life, then we kind of went back to normal, so I can't really then, so those first 2 weeks really hard.
Yeah. It really seems like when there's close proximity, the things that are unsaid or unresolved between people really start to add up, right? So maybe you have a roommate or partner who keeps leaving dishes in the sink, and it gradually starts to annoy you that there's not a clean sink. You've got that bottled up feeling and you really want to share that. Right? And it's an example of conflict management being useful, because by talking through that, we can both feel better and deal with that conflict that we're both experiencing. You had your hand up as well?
Yeah. So like at the beginning, Isabella was talking about how she feels bad for her parents because like they didn't sign up for it.
Mm-hmm.
And that really like resonated with me because my mom and I are both healthcare workers, and so between the two of us, we've been exposed to COVID like 10 times.
Wow.
Over the course of this, and like we've taken like over 30 COVID tests.
Wow.
And so like I just like really got what she was saying about that.
Yeah.
It is stressful when you're like, I think that I have COVID, and then like she has to take work off, and then I have to take work off, and it's already short staffed.
Yeah. Right. And the competing demands and stressors that you encounter can really impact those relationships too, especially, if you're both working in the same field or a similar field and interacting based on that too. So there's definitely been a lot of stresses that have become exacerbated for sure. Any other thoughts, observations, things that stood out to you, or maybe things from your own experience in this past year and a half that you've noticed in terms of your relationships? You'll notice I intentionally hold awkward conversations, like awkward silences, for as long as possible until somebody will speak up and be like, I've got something I've got to say to break this up.
I can keep sharing.
Sure, go for it.
Oh, this summer,
Mhm.
my boyfriend had got COVID. I was kind of pissed off, so I had to stay home from work, and then I never brought it.
Yeah.
But so he had to quarantine his 2 weeks, and then I wasn't allowed to, I was isolated with him, and then my
Right.
isolation didn't start until after his isolation, so
Yeah.
I missed a whole month of work.
Yeah.
We got in a lot of fights during that time, but yeah, it's great.
I can imagine, and the way that kind of labor falls on people,
Yeah.
having to deal with that for sure. Yeah, I'm really glad, to hear some of these stories, things that you found from the reading that were interesting, or ways that you all were able to connect, or sometimes not, to these experiences. Because, I think it's important for us to think about conflict management in context, where a lot of our relationships have been tested. Some relationships have ended, right, over the past year and a half, and there's been a lot of complications there. But other relationships have gotten a lot closer too. But both the material circumstances, the situations we found ourselves in, have been a lot different as we've had to consider things like quarantine, possible exposure to COVID-19, and so on, as well as the ways in which we've communicated about those issues, right? So using things such as social media, Zoom, and so on, studies have found that using like FaceTime or Zoom makes us a lot more exhausted, Zoom fatigue, but it also makes it more difficult for us to pick up on elements of our communication like nonverbal cues, right? We have to do a lot more brain work in order to make sense of how somebody else is communicating, like their facial expressions and so on, if we can't see and engage with them face to face. So that's definitely been a big source. And we also know that communication through things like text brings a lot of ambiguity too. There's uncertainty. I'm not doing good. Does that mean you have COVID? Did you get a positive test result? Like, what's going on? So there's a lot of conflict that can emerge from communication ambiguity too. But I wanted us to look at this to help put into context some of the challenges that we deal with. So how many of you have heard of or seen the old 1957 film 12 Angry Men? Just a couple of you. I know a few years ago, Amy Schumer did like a parody of this. So it's very old, obviously, all right, middle-aged to older, 12 angry white men. And this is a film that came out because the 12 angry men are jurors who are trying to render a verdict on a murder suspect, right? So the way this film plays out is the evidence seems pretty decisive. 11 of the 12 jurors say he's guilty, except for the one, and they need a unanimous decision. So there's one holdout who says, no, he's not guilty. I don't think he is. I think we need more time. And the whole film is an example of conflict management. And it's been adapted into a play in a lot of situations, but it's all about how these 12 folks communicate and work together to resolve the conflict and underlying disagreement over whether or not he's guilty. So I'm going to show you kind of a brief clip from it that helps to place into context some of the things that are going on here.
What's the matter with you? I have a reasonable doubt now.
So he's the dissenter.
All that stuff, the knife, the whole business.
You said we could throw out all the other evidence.
Well, what are we doing now? You're alone. I don't care whether I'm alone or not. It's my right. It's your right. Now, what do you want? I say he's guilty. I want to hear your arguments. I gave you my arguments. We're not convinced. We want to hear them again. You have as much time as it takes. Everything, every single thing that took place in that courtroom, but I mean everything, says he's guilty. What do you think, I'm an idiot or something? Why don't you take that stuff about the old man? The old man who lived there and heard everything. Well, this business about the knife. Well, oh, so he found another one exactly like it? The old man saw him right there on the stairs. What's the difference how many seconds it was? See the thing. The knife falling through a hole in his body. You can't prove he didn't get to the door. Sure, you can take all the time hobbling around the room, but you can't prove it. Now, what about this business of the L? And the movies? There's a phony deal if I ever heard one. I'll bet you $5,000 I remember the movies I saw. I'm telling you, everything that's going on has been twisted and turned. This business with the glasses? How do you know she didn't have them on? This woman testified in open court. And what about hearing the kid yell? Huh? I'm telling you, I've got all the facts here. Here. Well, I'd say that's the whole case. Well? Say something! You lousy bunch of bleeding hearts. You're not gonna intimidate me. I'm entitled to my opinion. Rotten kids, you work your life out. No. Not guilty. Not guilty.
So yeah, there's a lot of yelling in this movie. People gesticulating and overacting and all that fun stuff. But, right, it's a murder trial. They're looking at the evidence. There's this situation earlier in the film where a woman who's a witness and saw the murder had glasses, but she wasn't wearing glasses at the trial, right? So on face, we look at this happening and we're thinking, they're yelling, they're disagreeing with each other, but they're also really starting to unpack and look at the facts of the case and using things like conflict management to work together and try to figure out what's happening, how we make sense of the evidence, and whether or not this person is guilty of this murder charge, right? And we see this in a lot of cases with juries engaging in really heavy debate and disagreement, and a lot of larger scale discourse of how we feel about the outcome of the court case too, right? We saw that a few months ago in the George Floyd case, right? There's a lot of examples of very heated disagreement happening, but this debate and disagreement allowing us to really parse out and look at the details and facts of the situation. So I wanted to use this example to help us to contextualize and make sense of what conflict management is. And I'd like to, as we're defining this term for the course, unpack the different parts of that definition a little bit more. So conflict management is about mitigating negative outcomes and promoting the positive outcomes of conflict. So you can think about it, if you're somebody who likes to play video games, right, there's this idea of min-maxing, where you take your character's stats, you try to offset their bad stats and make their good stats, like their strength and magic, as good as possible. It's the same way with conflict management. You're trying to optimize and make a potential conflict go as well as it can. So we need to talk a little bit about what conflict is, what some of the negative outcomes of conflict are, and also promote some of the positive outcomes of conflict too. By the way, don't worry about needing to get these slides down for word. I post them after class for your review, so no need to take super word for word notes if you don't want to. I also want to do a quick check. I actually got a voice amplifier, but I come from kind of a public speaking debate background, so I know it can be kind of loud. Is the volume that I'm giving, the clarity sounding okay to folks so far? Awesome. If I'm ever unclear or you ever need me to go back at any point, just let me know and I'm happy to do that. So let's talk about what conflict management means in a little bit more detail. So conflict, one example of conflict we can think about are the two major political parties in the United States, right? That is a source of a lot of conflict, a lot of disagreement, right? And we tend to think about that as a pretty obvious example of conflict. It's oftentimes a struggle over values, right? So we can think about values as things that we see as super important. And oftentimes these values go into clashes with one another, right? So values of freedom versus security. That's a classic conflict, right? When we passed the US Patriot Act after 9/11, regarding sort of wireless surveillance of things such as phone activity and text, there was a heavy debate over, whether the security that provided was warranted, where things like freedoms played a role, and so on, right? That's an example of conflict because there's these two values that are clashing with one another and differing perspectives on how people feel. Values are oftentimes a really big source of these kinds of conflicts. Oftentimes when we're debating or disagreeing with somebody else on social or political issues, it can feel like we're on different planets because the values and beliefs that the other person holds feel radically different than the values or beliefs that we see as important, right? So the idea of scarcity is really important here, right? Because if we could have as many seats in Congress as we wanted, we wouldn't necessarily see the same conflict or disagreement between major political parties. It's the fact that something such as a US Senate or House seat has to go one way or the other that causes that scarcity and therefore source of disagreement. Power and resources also play a really big role too, right? Disagreement over how resources should be distributed, so things such as tax revenue, where does tax revenue and spending go, right, is another big source of conflict as well. But the idea that there is scarcity or that there are limited options available oftentimes drives conflict. It could be something as simple as, who's going to have the car today? Well, I need it for work. Well, I need it to go run errands. The fact that there's only one car available is going to be a source of conflict. So negative outcomes of conflict. We've talked about them a little bit already, but off the top of your head, what are some of the bad things that can happen when you get into a conflict with somebody?
Doesn't get resolved.
Doesn't get resolved, right? It keeps going and going. Yeah. What else?
Physical conflict.
Yeah.
It's a loss of a friend or someone you can trust.
Yeah, right? It can deteriorate your relationships and destroy the trust that you have in somebody, right? There's an anxiety that it never really gets resolved, which both can trigger fear and concern, but also can waste time too. You keep having the same argument with somebody over and over again. Feels like you're spinning your wheels. So here are some of the ways that we can think about negative outcomes of conflict, right? One of them being anxiety, right? We get really worked up and concerned about conflict. We have our fight or flight response activated. Again, many of us might be conflict avoidant. We don't like getting into arguments with other people. Stress is another big element of that. It stacks onto and adds onto the worries that you're already experiencing, right? If you're an essential worker, if you're working in healthcare and you have these interpersonal conflicts happening too, it's compounding. Feeling upset, right? You can feel angry or hurt out of that experience and it doesn't feel good. We can feel drained. It can take a lot out of you. Your breath might be hoarse by the end of it, and it just saps your energy. Hostility, right? Hurting your relationships with other people in the long term, but also worrying about escalation into aggression. Whether it's calling names, saying things to the other person that you later regret, or even things like physical violence. So conflict management is a crucial way that we can prevent a lot of situations of violence from happening, right? Through negotiating things such as peace treaties. Historically, there have been efforts to try to manage and deal with potential conflict. So I've alluded to this a little bit already, but what are some of the good things that we can get from conflict? What are some of the positive outcomes? If conflict goes well, what do we have to gain? Yeah, we solve the issue. There are no more dirty dishes in the sink. What else? Understanding, right? You can empathize with and get where the other person is coming from, and that can be preventative. It can prevent that constant cycle of getting into the same fight because now you know, okay, every time I'm going to put the dish in the shelf. What else?
Can strengthen relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. It can make our relationships better. Not only through empathy, but also because, we feel like the other person cares and cares to engage with us. Some other things that I would add, conflict can be used for things such as social change, right? One example, I focus a lot on disability rhetoric and advocacy, how folks with disabilities advocate for the needs that they care about. The Americans with Disabilities Act did not pass until 1990, and one of the major ways that advocates pushed for those issues was that they, several folks with disabilities, including those in wheelchairs, occupied a huge cross-section of the street in New York City. Slowed down traffic, but got attention. We see a lot of debates and discussion around things such as civil disobedience, forms of protest, and to what extent those forms of protest are acceptable or okay. But we do know that engaging in these kinds of conflicts can at times lead to major changes. Growth, right? A relationship can grow and strengthen over time. Maybe there's opportunity. You learn more. You empathize more with that person. Progress, you know. In the case of 12 Angry Men, because there's this holdout and discussion and debate about the evidence or the guilt or innocence of the person, they're able to make progress on the case and uncover details that didn't show up the first time, like the fact that the witness wasn't wearing glasses and maybe couldn't see the murder that was happening. Creativity, right? Conflict lets us hash out ideas and come up with clever solutions. Maybe you come up with a system of what days of the week one person has a car. And it can create positive energy and feelings going forward. You could feel a kind of euphoria after you successfully manage a conflict that will help your relationship in the future. So, we can think about some of the causes of conflict now that we've given some thought to some of the good and bad things that it can do, right? So one major source of conflict and debate that's happening right now in the United States is not just surrounding the COVID-19 vaccine and its distribution, since it's in the US fairly widely accessible for distribution, but there's also a lot of debate surrounding a COVID-19 booster, right? And taking an additional dose of the vaccine for its effects to last a longer time. And one of the sources of conflict is a concern about, taking a booster versus distribution throughout the world, and a lot of places in the world where a vaccine might not be available to folks, even at the level of the first dose, right? So, again, scarce resources is a major issue. Divided functions of society is another possible source of conflict. So on Monday, there were a couple examples brought up of working in customer service and working in retail and the challenges that might come when somebody has a complaint or has an issue, but because of your role, you can't resolve that problem. My order got canceled. Well, I can't, I'm not the person in charge of that. I can't help you with that. Power plays a big role too. So a lot of conflict that we have can emerge at times through unequal power relationships. So things such as a supervisor and employee, that conflict is going to play out really differently because of the power and influence that the employer has. And again, limited supplies, including something like vaccine, right, are examples of sources of conflict. The other thing to think about here is where conflict might be emerging. So I'll give you one example. The way that we use nonverbal forms of expression can look really different depending on the part of the world that we're in. So for instance, in the United States, we oftentimes see eye contact as a sign that we're listening to, we care about, and we want to engage with the other person, right? Eye contact is a good thing. Whereas in a lot of other cultures and even countries, such as Japan, eye contact is not the norm in the same way, right? Eye contact could be read as disrespectful. So depending on the situation, eye contact, the intention to be good and to be attentive could be read as disrespect to somebody else, right? Intention of what we say and do versus impact of what we say and do can be a really big source of disagreement. Conflict happens interpersonally, right? So interpersonal communication is communication between two people. This is one of the most common forms of conflict, right? You get into a fight or an argument with somebody else. Organizational, so 12 angry men, right? 12 jurors arguing over the guilt or innocence of somebody on trial for murder. Community, so maybe there's a shared population or group. For instance, a town hall debate or town hall event can create a lot of disagreement and discord among its group members. If you're like me and you've watched the show Parks and Rec, right, there's oftentimes a lot of like random citizens of the town who come into these town hall events and have weird things to say and argue about, right, which fits under that definition. And again, intercultural and international, communicating across different cultures is how we might define intercultural communication. And because of those ambiguities or changes in how communication happens between different cultures, that can be a source of issues too. Again, think about that eye contact example as well. Conflict can also happen across different ones at the same time. So maybe you're having an argument with a friend and a third party comes in and it becomes more of a group situation. We oftentimes dislike this feeling of being ganged up on or dogpiled, right? Where people will come in and join a conflict on a particular side and essentially outnumber the other person. So these categories can definitely be in flux. So there's three major categories of ways that we can deal with and address conflict as it happens. We can think about negotiation as essentially reaching some type of communication agreement with the other person. So negotiation could include things such as a compromise, meeting in the middle, nobody's happy, but people got a little bit of what they wanted. It can also be through mediation. So maybe you bring in a third party or neutral person who hears both people out and is able to render some type of judgment or solution. For instance, if somebody sees a couples counselor, right, that counselor usually serves as a third party or mediator for that type of discussion. We also have disengagement, right? So disengagement is leaving the situation and generally exiting the conflict in general. So it's changing the subject, it's leaving the room, that sort of thing. And then coercion is kind of the other way around. It's having the other person essentially bend to support what the other person wants, right? So you can think of coercion as being voluntold or compelled to do something. So I'd like us to take a couple minutes and think about the strengths and weaknesses along with an example of this type of conflict management. So I'm going to have folks over here talk a little bit about negotiation, folks over here in the middle set of seats talk about disengagement, and folks here on this side talk about coercion. So just take a couple minutes among your folks and talk about, you know, the good and the bad and an example of this type of conflict management.
Where is this engagement?
Negotiation, disengagement, coercion.
That's a good idea to use this. I would say is when it's done escalated, you get like a point where someone's gonna try to use it really bad. We have weaknesses, this one is like really like so just if someone's like trying to call you out, they're like texting you stuff, you can just disengage. That's when like she's like too far away. Try and just
Planning, thinking ahead, moves really well.
I was doing anything like that. Yeah. Or you can split.
Like a week, and it's gonna be cool.
Anything that involves like choose a relationship.
Is there like a weekend Yeah, on this time. Yeah.
Yeah, we get in there back or
We oftentimes think of coercion as a bad thing, but like there's some times where something needs to get done, right? There has to be, like, if you're an employer, you say, you gotta turn this in by the end of the week. There has to be some level of resolving, getting the wheels turning. Alright, seems like folks have some good ideas to share. Let's talk about this a little bit together. So I'd like to hear first from the negotiation group over here. So what did you all talk about in terms of conflict management through negotiation?
We kind of said that negotiation is like always a good idea as a way to end conflict, because like it kind of helps stop it and you still get like a part of what you wanted.
Yeah, right. Like a lot of us don't like compromise. It's not fun to not get everything you want. Right? We talk about like sacrificing a sacred cow, but there's still something that people can have to gain, and there's the challenge in navigating a way to make that fair. What about disengagement?
We said a good idea, a good time to use it would be like when you're in a physical altercation and it's to the point where people might start beating each other up. Because you don't want that. You don't want people getting hurt. And then the weakness though is that it can leave stuff unsolved sometimes.
Yeah.
And then that's kind of the example too.
Yeah, right? Like, sometimes it's okay to run, right? Like, if there's a situation where, for your safety or for whatever reason, you need to exit a situation, there's contexts for that, right? If you're, as a silly example, if you're playing a video game, you're level 20 and you encounter like a level 80 something or other, like you're gonna try to, run away and get out of that because you're gonna lose. So, disengagement can sometimes make sense. What about coercion?
We talked about something that would be good, or this would be good in situations like emergency situations. Specifically, I thought about like health care situations. So if somebody's like unconscious on the ground, you can't sit around and like discuss what should you do. You need somebody to take charge in those types of situations.
Yeah, like sometimes, there just needs to be this shift in power, right? There's a joke going around about, is there a doctor in the house? Oh yes, I have a doctor in philosophy. I'm not a real doctor, right? Like, you wouldn't have somebody like that taking on that kind of role. You want to make sure that people step aside and that somebody who has the authority or power to manage a crisis is there to do so. Crisis communication is a whole field with a lot of work and really interesting insights. And so, that's a situation that's important. Oftentimes in terms of employment situations too, like an employee doesn't want to finish a report necessarily, but the boss has to say, hey, I need this done by the end of the week. So sometimes coercion can be a useful skill. So I wanted to use these examples in order to highlight that conflict management doesn't look the same every time. And while I've harped on a fair bit in the class that managing and engaging with conflict can be a good thing, it's worth thinking about the situation, the context in which conflict management makes sense, right? And a lot of this, I know, is trying to get into basic introductory stuff about how conflict works, but I think it'll set a really good groundwork for us as we go forward in things like our study groups, as well as thinking about specific situations where conflict happens. So to bring together the things that we've talked about for today, we started by looking at that New York Times piece that was getting into different ways that families have experienced conflict. We talked a lot about how proximity and being with somebody 24/7 right, can uniquely become grading and create new conflict scenarios. We also looked at the example, right, of 12 Angry Men and the ways that things through film can depict the challenges of reaching a conclusion on an issue where people really disagree. We talked about conflict management, what it means, and both the positive and negative outcomes. Remember, we're trying to highlight the positive, stamp out the bad things a conflict can do. And then we discussed some contexts. Again, situations, like in a crisis situation where coercion makes sense, or situations where negotiation and people getting a bit of what they want can work really well too. So for next class, I am asking you to read the Jant article, or the Jant book for this course. But if you're still waiting on your copy, you're not able to access it yet, that's okay because I've included a PDF of the first chapter. So for Friday's class, I'd like you to read that first chapter of Jant. We've gone over a lot of the things that it covers already, but next class we'll get more into the issue of groupthink. We'll be looking at the case study of Bay of Pigs, as well as understanding how to engage in effective listening to do the positive outcomes that we've been talking about. So Dan, I'll have the recording up after class. You can access that PDF through the front page of Canvas. Otherwise, I hope you all have an awesome afternoon. Feel free to get in touch with me with any questions. I'll have the recording and slides up for you in just a bit.